In today's deep dive, I thought it'd be useful to look at some of the recommended Chrome device and Chrome user policies you can set using the admin console. So we're doing all the security audits we do. One of the things we look at is Chrome policy configuration for managing browsers and managing Chrome devices, just to make sure the recommended policies are in effect to ensure that those devices are as secure and as well managed as they can be. So that can be divided into two sections. You've got user policies and device settings. And in the admin console, you can find these, as I'm sure many of you already know, but just in case you don't, under devices, Chrome, and settings. And once you go into settings, then we've got tabs to see user and browser settings, device settings, and managed guest settings. And if we just jump back to user and browser settings and have a look down here. So there's a few useful things to note on this page. We've got icons here which show what types of devices these settings will apply on. So this setting here for maximum user session length only applies on Chrome devices. Then we've got other settings which might only apply to Windows, Android, or iOS devices as well. So worth taking note of those icons. And also, there's just a huge number of policies now, something like 200 or 300. So do make use of the search filter at the top here. So just type in the setting you want to search for. So whether that's something maybe account related, and then it will find all the settings which reference the word account. So do make use of the search there as well. Cool, so let's start by looking at some of our recommended user settings. So the first one I wanted to talk about is how we manage apps and extensions for Chrome devices. One of the things we commonly find is that students and staff can install any app or extension they like on a Chromebook, whereas what we recommend is controlling that a bit more tightly, in the same way as we've been doing with looking at the third-party app usage last year for under 18s. We recommend a similar process for managing apps and extensions on Chrome devices as well. So when it comes to managing these on the admin console, if we go to apps and extensions, so here we can see what apps and extensions we've trusted and are allowing, or we might be force installing. If I click on users and browsers, and let's select read along by Google, for instance. So this one is currently set to allow install. I could, if I want to, force install it, or I could also force install and pin it to the Chrome OS taskbar, or optionally block that extension as well. But when it comes to managing who can install what extension, you can do this by selecting additional settings. This will then jump to the user settings policy. And you can see here on our domain, we've got it configured at the moment to block all apps, and the admin manages the allow list. So our users on this domain can only install extensions that I allow. One useful option here is you can actually change this to block all apps. We manage the allow list as an admin, but we can also set it so users can actually request extensions as well. They can do that when they go to the Chrome Web Store, and they'd see a different button there where they could request that extension. And then we get a notification as an admin and can go through the workflow on the admin console to either allow that extension or ignore that request if it's not an appropriate extension you want your users to use. So well worth configuring that on your admin console. So yeah, we just talked about how to pin apps and extensions and allowing and blocking extensions. And just another thing to note here. So if you did want to still allow users to install any extension, another option you could look at is blocking extensions by the rights they ask for from that device. So for instance, I don't know if you can see it there on the screenshot, but we've got set proxy as a blocked extension permission. So that means any extension that wants access to Chrome to set a proxy will be automatically blocked. So that's another option you could look at, but I would highly recommend just blocking all extensions and then trusting the extensions that you want your users to use. Actually, one more thing on that before I move on is, before blocking extensions, you probably want to get an idea of what extensions your users are actually using. So you can do this by going to Reports and App and Extension Usage, and this will show all the extensions. If we select all extensions, we've got a date filter up here as well. So give it a moment to load. And this will show us all extensions installed by our users, sorted by the most popular, so for most installs. So super useful to look at this first, allow the extensions you know your users are using for educational purposes, and then you can switch out to being blocked in the future. So incognito mode, highly recommend disallowing incognito mode, especially for your students. And the reason for us is obviously incognito mode means that no history is being recorded on that device, but also many of the content filters used on Chromebooks, so things like light speed and security, they are a browser extension, and for that extension to run, it needs to be installed with a Chrome browser. But if you open up incognito mode, extensions are automatically turned off while you're in incognito mode. So it means that no history is going to be recorded, and you won't get insights into what, or tracking information into what your students and staff are doing. So do make sure that is disabled on your devices. Safe browsing. So by default, this is set to allow users to decide whether safe browsing is used on a Chrome device. I recommend enforcing this so it's automatically on for your users, and it just helps protect your users from malware and phishing content on the internet. So highly recommend turning this on as well. Of course, you can configure homepage and pages to load on startup. So very useful setting to do there. And just to mention, on this setting and many other settings on Chrome now, you can actually configure these by OU, but also by group as well now, which is a fairly new feature added last year. Safe search and YouTube restricted mode. So highly recommend enabling safe search and enforcing that for all of our users. One setting we don't see always configured is you can actually set YouTube to restricted mode, so it only shows safe content for your learners. So also recommend turning that on and checking that is enabled. Idle settings. I normally recommend, particularly for staff users, setting this to a lower value. I'd normally suggest about 10 minutes for a staff user on a Chromebook. Students, you might want a little bit longer, but where staff do have access to more sensitive data, it's worthwhile setting that idle timeout to be a bit lower. Secondary accounts. So my preferred setup on a Chromebook when giving these out to students is to allow them to sign in using only their school account to that device, and also disallowing any secondary accounts. So once they've signed in using their school account as that primary account, they can't then go ahead and add any other personal accounts to that device. It keeps it much simpler for the student, much easier to manage for you, and you've got much more control. It also cuts down on any confusion about where they're saving any work, because I've seen it in the past where students are signed into multiple Google accounts. They thought they were working on one account, when in fact they were saving their work to a completely different account and lose track of that and think they've lost their work. So keep it simple and just restrict it to their primary school account where you've got the most control for that user. You can also use Chrome policies to block URLs. So probably best to do this in your content filter, but if there ever was a need to block particular pages across all your Chrome devices or particular groups, then you can actually do this from a Chrome device, so from the browser policy as well. But one scenario where I have used this and it's come in useful before is testing for students. So in this example, you might have set up some exam accounts for students and you want to restrict them to only using perhaps Google Docs and Slides. So in that case, you can actually flip this on its head and just trust those two sites and block all other sites. So those students can't go off and browse the internet, but they can still access Docs and Slides to produce their exam work. So super useful setting there. Download location. So this will by default go to the local Chromebook when you download something from the internet. I recommend directing all your downloads to Google Drive. That way you can be absolutely sure that nothing is ever going to go missing. You get saved to Drive by default. Does mean you end up with a bit more on your Google Drive, but I'd much rather that than having the potential for users to download something from the internet, do some work on it, and it go missing. Much better to have it all saved in Drive by default. And talking about downloads, you can also impose download restrictions on a Chrome device as well, or Chrome browser. There's multiple levels. I'd recommend setting it to block all malicious downloads to filter out any potential malware there. Manage bookmarks. So of course you can also manage bookmarks for your users and have suggested and recommended bookmarks available in the browser for your students and staff. And I think this is our last user setting. So you can also, under user and browser settings, disable particular parts of a device hardware. So you could disable the webcam on a device or speakers. So in certain scenarios, that can be useful. Maybe it's a kiosk machine, or maybe it's devices which are used for exams again, and you want to disable any webcams or any audio in that. And one other option there to look at as well is around usage of USB keys. So particularly if you have Chromebooks for staff, you might not want staff to download any school documents onto a USB key and then lose that on a bus or a train. So you can actually set USB keys to be read-only or disable them completely. So do look at that option as well. And custom wallpaper. So you can customize wallpaper for your school, and you could even customize it for particular groups of users too. Okay, so that's user settings, and all of those will apply to managed browsers, but also users signing into a Chrome device or signing into their own Chrome browser at home. Now we're going to look at device settings, and these are settings which are enabled from the Chrome Education Upgrade license. And that license lets you apply device settings, but also manage those devices much more tightly. And we'll see that as we go through these and review these settings. So first one here is you can specify who can actually sign in to a device. So as I mentioned earlier, you might only want school users signing into your Chromebooks. So you can actually use a wildcard here and specify just your school domain and automatically block any other personal accounts from being signed into your devices. And a nice time saver here is you can also auto-complete the domain for your users. So you don't have to type that in every time. Makes it much faster for your users to sign in. This is a particularly useful setting if you're giving out student devices. So you've got a BYOD program, and you want to enable students to use their personal accounts outside of school hours, then you can configure this using off-hours sign-in. So perhaps between 8 and 5 o'clock, you want students to only use their school account, but outside of those hours, they can actually sign into their Chromebook using their personal account. So you can actually configure that here if you want to. Disable device return instructions. This is super useful, and one of the big reasons to get a Chrome Education Upgrade license is if you want to control those devices more tightly, particularly if you're in a scenario where maybe someone's lost a device or someone's not handed their device back in, if you're operating check-in and check-out devices, then you can actually disable that device using the admin console and set up return instructions on that device as well. So if it does get found, it gets powered on and it can't be used, but the user can see a return message to return it to that school. And this has saved me numerous times as well. One time in particular, we had lost a Chromebook at the college I used to work at, and it actually turned up at a car boot sale several miles away from, actually quite about 50 miles away from the college. And the person who purchased it actually phoned us up and said, "Oh, I've just bought your device, but it doesn't work." So yeah, it did enable us to get that device back and in operation again. And assessment. So one of the other options to look at here, which having device management allows on the Chromebooks, is you can start using Chrome devices for assessments in your school. So there's a couple of scenarios you could look at there if you wanted to do that. So one is to use kiosk mode and have the Chromebook launch a particular exam app, and it's restricted to just that app. Or if you're using Google Forms and have an assessment in there you want your students to complete, teachers can actually use an option called locked mode on Google Forms. And when students open up that Google form via Classroom, their Chromebook will be locked to that form. They can't navigate away from that form or browse any other websites until they've completed and submitted their work in the form. So do have a look at those options as well. So yeah, that's all of the recommended policies I just wanted to highlight there. There are many, many more. As I mentioned at the beginning of that part of the call, there are several hundred settings to explore there, but that's my top recommended settings I'd suggest you look at and review and just make sure you've got configured in the best way possible.